Shall we?
And we just trying.
Shall we start? Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us despite the beautiful Saturday afternoon weather. My name is John Nery. It is my happy task to serve as moderator of the discussion this afternoon. I'm a newspaper editor and columnist. I work in a country where press freedom is under attack, where fake news, the term, is used to demonize sources of inconvenient information, and where the president is himself one of the primary sources of disinformation. No, I don't work in the United States. I work in the Philippines. Of course, I could have said Hungary or Turkey or many other parts of the world. I just thought I'd show you. This is my second time to be at the International Journalism Festival. This year, Media Under Attack is a separate category. So here we have 9 panel discussions, plus there are a few more. Altogether, I counted about 14 or 15 sessions which can be classified under Media Under Attack. That's about 5% of the 301 sessions in IJF 18. And that says something. Just to very quickly set the context, I'm going to cite 3 different sources. This is a recent book published by UNESCO with the help of the International Media Support Group. It talks about a profession under attack. The survey period is from the 10 years ending in 2016. And during that time, 827 journalists were killed. Of these 827, 94% were men, and only 8% were considered solved. The International News Safety Institute keeps track of casualties in our profession. In 2017, this is the way it looked. With 46 journalists and media workers killed in Asia, which includes the Middle East. The 5 worst countries last year, unfortunately my country is there, the Philippines, but you also have Syria with the civil war, and Mexico with the drug wars, and Afghanistan. I'm borrowing a couple of slides from the Index on Censorship. This is from their mapping of press freedom. In 2017, over 1,000 violations were committed just in the, I think, 46 or so countries that they survey in Europe. This is a summary of the types of violation. So, of course, death, there is no appeal. But there are also violations classified as assault or injury, detention or arrest, criminal charges and harassment lawsuits. There are acts of intimidation, including online harassment, sexual harassment, trolling, and cyberbullying. There have been 113 incidents in the 46 countries alone where professionals had their property confiscated, and 178 instances where their access to sources was blocked, and censorship was reported or monitored at least 68 times. So these are the different types of attacks that journalists face, and it's just become much worse. Our format is very simple. I'm going to ask our 3 distinguished panelists to start with an opening presentation, maybe about 4 to 6 minutes each. And then after that, we'll have a few questions among ourselves, and then we'll open the floor. I'm hoping we can have at least 25 to 30 minutes of questions from people in the audience. Rachel wanted to emphasize not just questions, but if you have suggestions, proposed solutions, they would be very welcome too. Let me start. My order here is in the order in which I had the privilege of inviting our guests. Marie Lipinski is a Pulitzer Prize winner. She served as editor-in-chief of the Chicago Tribune, where she oversaw the work of several other Pulitzer Prize winners. And then she served for over a decade on the Pulitzer board. Since 2011, it's my great privilege to know, she has served as the curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism in Harvard University. Rachael Jolley is editor-in-chief of Index on Censorship, which is a quarterly and really a necessary publication. She's worked in different fields. She's written for The Guardian, The Independent, The Daily Telegraph, The Times, as well as done work on television. She also co-wrote the play Murdering the Truth. Is this fiction or? Yeah. Last but certainly not least, Irene Caselli is an Italian journalist who has lived and worked in Argentina and other parts of Latin America for many years. She has worked for the top organizations like BBC. She's written for the Washington Post, the New York Times. And when Hugo Chavez died, she was the BBC correspondent in Caracas on the spot. I'd like to welcome the three journalists to our panel. I will just end my context setting by referring to the page for this particular talk, where we discussed the need to also approach this topic from the macro point of view. There have been other workshops, other seminars, where we talked about micro. What do journalists need to do to protect themselves, to fight back? Here we're going to take a step back and try to think about maybe larger, more general questions. Should journalists file lawsuits? Should they reach out to opposition political parties? Those are the questions that we hope we can address this afternoon. Okay, now I'm going to get out of the way. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Rachael Jolley.
I'm just going to let the technical guys do wizardry. Yeah? Oh, okay, so it should be on, right? No? Let me go back. Let me go this way. Yes. Okay. So, thank you, John. I'm just going to do a brief introduction about Index on Censorship and how our approach to this subject, some of which John has already told you, so I'm going to skip over those bits. As he mentioned, my name is Rachael Jolley. I'm the editor of Index on Censorship magazine, which is a global magazine covering freedom of expression issues. We have contributors and contributing editors around the world, including in Turkey, Argentina. Well, we just lost our Argentina contributing editor, and in many, many other places. The magazine was launched in 1972, and it was launched after a set of Soviet writers wrote to people in London, and they were talking about how their work was censored in the Soviet Union, and they wanted a way of publishing work, journalism and other writing, so people could see what was happening. So the magazine has always been global in its outlook and covered all issues around the world. And it includes publishing fiction about that has been censored, as well as journalism about the different issues. As well as being a publisher, we have a small campaigning team, and we arrange an annual awards, which includes a year-long fellowship. We have one of which is in journalism. The winners are invited to London, and they're supported throughout the year in improving their skills and sets of workshops that might help them give their work impact or protect themselves in different ways. This year's Journalism Award went to the Maldives Independent, which you may know about, where the Maldives Independent is an incredible small news media organization that has come under incredible pressure. Some of their journalists have been disappeared, and the editor was forced to leave the country last year and move to India, and now she's based in Doha. And so, as you can imagine, they are under incredible pressure to stop doing their work. We also run a project called Mapping Media Freedom, which you've just heard a little about. It's in 42 countries in Europe and Greater Europe. We have a set of freelance correspondents, but anyone can make a report to the map, and it's then fact-checked by our editors in London before being published. And this is some of the details of recent numbers that have been reported to the map. And that's just one example of the type of attacks that we see. So what I wanted to talk about today was why we're seeing an attack on the truth. So we recently did an issue of the magazine saying the truth is in danger. Why is the truth in danger? Because people would rather that journalists shut up when they criticized or created reports that governments, generally governments, would prefer were not published, and the public was least not well informed. And what we're seeing is lots of different types of pressure on journalists in different ways to the same kind, with the same kind of outlook, the same kind of outcome that people were trying to achieve in the 70s, basically, that there would be reporters and writers would be silenced, but just using a different set of tools. So we work with journalists in different ways to help inform them about what they can do. We also work quite closely with the Rory Peck Trust, which does incredible work with freelance journalists in terms of security training and financial support. So 2 ideas I wanted to float by you in terms of how we might look at journalists under attack differently. So one of which is about journalist solidarity. So what we hear a lot from journalists is, when they came for me, why did no one speak up? And now they've come for you, and now you expect me to shout for you. And it's that concept of people being divided by their politics. So the left-wing journalists are not speaking up for the right-wing journalists, or vice versa. So politics is being allowed to divide the journalism community. So I would argue that if we can overcome that, and we speak up for journalism when it's under attack in all its forms, and not just for the journalists that we like or the journalists whose politics we like, journalism as a unit, as a community, will be much stronger and much harder to break. So, for example, we often hear from Turkish journalists who say that they were attacked. They came under fire 10 years ago, and the other journalists didn't stand up for them. The principle of journalism was not defended. And now, as we're seeing incredible pressure on journalists today in Turkey, but journalists as a whole in Turkey are quite divided. So how can we create stronger journalistic communities that are not divided by politics, and then use that community as a tool, a powerful tool to fight back and put pressure on different elements such as government? So that's one element. And I think I've heard in different sessions at the festival, I've heard people talking about left and right and how we shouldn't cover these people because we don't agree with their politics. And in my opinion, what we're doing is we're creating a much more fractured and less powerful community. And the other idea I wanted to put forward was the idea of creating unlikely partnerships, unlikely coalitions. So the American writer David Frum wrote about this the other day, and so I'm sort of bouncing off that in a way, but it's a well-known campaigning idea. So when you want to put pressure on a government, you have to look at who their allies are and who they are likely to listen to. So in the context of British politics, where we currently have a Conservative government, the bodies that the government tends to listen to are the farmers, for instance, the doctors. There are particular think tanks. So when journalists come under attack in different ways, when they want to put pressure back on government, I think we should be looking at how we create a powerful coalition of allies that are outside journalism and who, finding points of contact that they will support us on, and using that coalition to be really a strong advocate to either fight back on pressure to stop something like a fake news law being put through, or a change in the law that might have ramifications for freedom of expression. So I'm going to stop there, just put those ideas out there, and pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you. Before I call on Irene, a quick question for Rachel. Today, how can other journalists express solidarity with journalists under attack?
I think there are lots of different ways. I mean, we at Index, we are just launching some information around slaps. These are vexatious lawsuits that are being used a lot in Europe currently. So Daphne Caruana Galizia, the Maltese journalist who was killed recently, she was hit with a lot of these lawsuits, and other Maltese journalists are also being hit with them. And they're often working on their own as freelance or in very small news organizations. They don't have anyone to refer to necessarily, and don't know that other news organizations or news journalists also are getting these kind of lawsuits. So what we're encouraging anyone who gets those type of lawsuits at the moment is to register them on our Mapping Media Freedom site, and also so that we can collate them and connect people together. And we're also helping people like the Shift News in Malta to get together with human rights lawyers who can help them with legal advice to advise on best how to react and the best way of defending themselves.
Thank you. Now may I call on Irene, please?
Yes. So thank you so much for having me on this panel. As John was saying, I am a freelance reporter. I've been based in Latin America for about a decade. I was in Chile, Ecuador, then Venezuela, and most recently Argentina. And I also contribute to Index on Censorship. So I would like to start by mentioning the sad news that we received from Ecuador yesterday. A news team that was abducted in late March on the border with Colombia has been confirmed dead. We're talking about reporter Javier Ortega, photographer Paul Rivas, and driver Efraín Segarra, who worked for the daily El Comercio, and they were abducted while reporting on Ecuador's northern border, and most likely executed by a splinter group of the FARC rebels. I'm starting by mentioning this because Latin America has many ongoing conflicts that are often not necessarily known as much, but the lives of many local journalists are very often at risk. And actually in 2017, Latin America and the Caribbean were one of the deadliest regions in the world. Different indexes say different things, but Mexico definitely is up there, as we were saying. However, many governments have either attacked journalists, deeming them as enemies, like in Ecuador, for example, Argentina or Venezuela, or have completely failed to protect them and investigate their deaths, like in Mexico and in Central America. So I'm going to quickly look at 3 different countries, Ecuador, Argentina, and Mexico, to just kind of propose some of the solutions that have come up in this context that are very, very different. So Ecuador first has one of the trickiest laws when it comes to reporting that was introduced by former President Rafael Correa in 2013. So internationally, Correa was often depicted as a guardian of free speech because he granted Julian Assange asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. But actually back home, Correa silenced journalists and insulted them, and also silenced whistleblowers. He famously, for example, tore to pieces a newspaper in front of the public, called reporters ink assassins. And most importantly, though, he sued many media organizations, cartoonists, by using this tricky law he put in place in 2013. So the law requires all information disseminated by the media to be verified and precise. Now, that's very tricky to establish and can really open door to retaliation. As we all know, we all think that we're doing our best, but what if a detail slips out, you know? It also the law prohibits censorship, which is defined as a failure by private media outlets to cover issues that the government considers of public interest. So the new government of President Lenin Moreno has announced it will overturn the law, and it's definitely very positive that they've declared 4 days of national mourning for the death of this journalist. But the environment is still very unsupportive of journalists. They are seen by the public as people not to be trusted after years of this very violent rhetoric. So with this media law and with all this context, one of the solutions that some independent journalists have come up with are independent websites that are basically using anonymous or collective bylines, so where journalists do not sign with their own name and often have their web domains set up in foreign countries. So examples of this are Plan V or Mil Hojas. And so important investigative reporting comes out in these ways. Let's jump quickly to Mexico, which, as most of you here I'm sure know, is extremely dangerous for journalists who have to negotiate between drug cartels, security forces, and with very few resources and oftentimes very poor training. So Article 19 in Mexico says 115 journalists have been killed in Mexico since 1990. Many of them in broad daylight, and most of these deaths have actually not been investigated. So, for example, just a little bit over a year ago, Miroslava Breach was killed in the city of Chihuahua on the northern border with the US. She was pulling out of her garage with one of her children in her car when she was shot several times, and she died on the way to the hospital, and then they left a sign saying Tatolte. So there's also research by the New York Times that has established that prominent journalists have been the target of government surveillance. So the solutions in Mexico are very few, but a few have been suggested. For example, some apps have been developed to try and increase security of journalists and newsrooms. There's one app that I've seen colleagues use that is called Salama, and you basically answer some 30 or so questions about how you go about reporting. You know, do you go out at night, during the day, who do you tell that you're going out, etc. And then it kind of gives you kind of a private risk assessment. So this is a solution for some private journalists that don't have other resources. And then there are networks. So when I was in Juarez on the border reporting, I saw many journalists who had a very clear buddy system in place. So whenever they went out reporting, they would tell one of their colleagues they were going out and report back to them every half hour. If they missed a couple of times, then the alert was out. And then journalists are also very aware of, for example, freebies at conferences and things like that to try and avoid being spied on. But of course, the solutions are very limited, and many still have to go into hiding, migrate, and killings are still up. And finally, quickly, Argentina, very different scenario, a lot of financial pressure. So under the Kirchner governments, there was a lot of pressure to basically get power away from private media. And so the government set up a lot of new state media that were used to report on social, on social issues that are usually ignored by private media, but sometimes became government propaganda. So a lot of money was basically poured into this new media. But since the government change in 2015, the new president, which is of course on the other side of the political spectrum, pulled out all this money. And since 2015, some 3,000 journalists have lost their jobs. And anecdotally, there is a Facebook page that I'm part of, and there are some 10,000 members. And I can tell you there are at least 50 CVs uploaded every day, people looking for work. And so one solution, one newspaper basically took the matter in its own hands. It's called Tiempo Argentino. They had millions of financing from the government, and their owner disappeared from one day to another, basically left some 150 people on the street without any salaries, having paid nothing for over a year. And so the journalists got together, they set up a cooperative, and they relaunched. And the first self-managed edition that came out in 2016 sold 35,000 copies. And the paper now functions as an online daily and appears in print on Sundays. And everyone on staff, we're talking directors, editors, journalists, but also the cleaners, earn the same amount per hour. So this has meant a serious reduction of money for some of the sort of top editors, but for some it's actually meant either same wage or slightly better conditions. And they also have a subscription system in place to basically support them. And it now remains one of the few papers that is critical of the government.
Thank you, Irene. Before I call on Anne-Marie, a quick question for you. I know there's a great diversity of conditions, but which of the solutions or solutions in progress do you think strikes you as most promising?
So I think my main worry is that I don't see I don't see a promising solution when it comes to insecurity, and that's partly because if the government doesn't come in with serious policies and impunity doesn't stop, there's very little, I'm afraid, that can be done from a grassroots level or from the journalist sides, besides kind of like watching each other's back. And so I strongly agree that networks are incredibly important, and that's how colleagues help each other, even in unsafe conditions. But I think that the greatest threat in terms of at least casualties is insecurity, and there's very little to be done there.
Wow, all right.
Sorry.
Now may I call on Anne-Marie?
Thank you, John, and thank you all for foregoing an hour out of the amazing Peruvian sun to be with us this afternoon. I didn't think anyone would. I just wanted to start in setting what I think is a little bit of historic context and some of the reason we're in this moment we're in. Last year was the centennial of the Pulitzer Prize in the United States, and the opening event in Washington included a discussion among a group of journalists who had with amazing distinction covered the war in Vietnam. And these were just, some of the great names of our profession, and in listening to them, one of the things I was really struck by was that war, and I don't just mean the Vietnam War, but the way we reported on war doesn't exist anymore. And the crucial difference I want to call out today, the crucial difference for journalists, is they were describing a moment where combatants needed journalists to tell their stories. And so journalists were, as a consequence, allowed into theaters of battle. They were they could speak with some degree of interview with some degree of safety people who were waging war. They could go into so-called, they could be reporting for a certain country and go into so-called enemy territory and have a fair expectation, not 1,000%, but generally you could safely return to your newsroom at some point. Combatants don't need you anymore. They don't need us anymore in that way. And that is just a radical difference. Think about ISIS, think about the Taliban. They have the same access to YouTube that you do. And so whether they want to use social media, social media has revolutionized our business, but it's also revolutionized theirs. And so whether they want to convey word of, a manifesto or a beheading, they don't need to go through you. This notion of, disintermediation is not one that they need or subscribe to. And so that's the historic context in which we're working. So you as a journalist enter into dangerous and difficult territory without that sense of certainty that our predecessors did. And that's just a very important thing to mark, and also to say that we will not turn back from that. These tools that are available to them as they are to us are not going away. So that fundamental change is one we really have to address as an industry. The other thing is, I think we used to think about this as kind of in old terms, like I just described it as, journalists were in danger when they went into war. But now we're, as have been described by my colleagues, we're facing other arenas of intimidation, where it's not just the fear of crossfire that one has to face, but fear of detention, fear of prosecution, fear of a financial attack on your very institution, which some of John's colleagues in the Philippines have been facing, that completely undermines your ability to run an economic business. We used to think of this as the kinds of things that happened in certain countries. But guess what? I mean, John opened with a set of remarks and basically said these could be taking place. I could be describing the United States at this moment. And if you think that's too far-fetched, I mean, just think about something that's happening in recent days, which is President Trump's attack on Amazon, owned by Jeff Bezos, by going through the U.S. postal system, when I think we all know what this is about. We know this is about Mr. Bezos' ownership of the Washington Post, a fake news institution in the words of the president. So this is, the grounds have shifted really dramatically in terms of how we used to talk about this. And I also think that whether it's Trump or Duterte, they've done a really brilliant job of kind of co-opting the language that you need to wage this kind of attack on the press. Fake news used to mean a very particular thing, and I think we all know what that was. It was the rise of complete, utterly manufactured stories. The Pope endorses Trump, that kind of thing. And within seeming minutes of the election of the new president of the United States, that term was immediately co-opted as a description of news he didn't like, journalists he disagreed with. And that is commonly how it's used, not just in my country, but in other places as well. I want to talk just, if I could then, for a minute about, sort of notions about how to confront this. One of the things is I think that journalists have long been talking about this kind of to ourselves, right? We organize among ourselves, we hold dinners for ourselves, we give prizes to each other. And I think we have to really reframe and reset this debate and think about the allies. Who are our allies in this conversation? People who have as much at stake as we do as journalists. I'm really fortunate to work under President Drew Faust at Harvard, who's been saying something in the last year that's really resonated with me. And she's been talking about the way, the extent to how much the academy and journalism has in common at this moment. That the attack on truth and the attack on fact is as undermining to academic life, to academic research, to scientists, to librarians, to name your institution as it is to journalists. And we need to think about this as not just our own industry, but in a broader social framework. And those people are all of our allies, and we theirs. We recently co-hosted a conference at Nieman, MisinfoCon, it was called, and we had members of all of those institutions working with us, including coders and others who could help us think about solutions to this. Librarians are amazing allies to us in this particular moment, and I think we think of them as people we go to for research when we're doing a story, but there's much more that we have in common. And I'll tell you also that we included at this conference one of the most successful, one of the major purveyors of genuine fake news pre-election in the United States, somebody who made a lot of money and got very rich until he was outed by NPR, actually, as being the person behind this exercise, so we could understand, we could understand that business model, which is a really interesting one. I also think that there's this moment, certainly in my country, where protest is taking on a really new and rich form, and you're seeing it currently around gun control or gun legislation or gun rights issues. And this generation is coming up that is seeing things very differently than their parents did. They grew up with, a camera in their pocket. They grew up knowing how to deal and respond to trolls. They're not intimidated by the same things that intimidate their elders. And they have a very facile way of talking about change and kind of forcing it and forcing conversation. And we need to take advantage of that and this, kind of a fresh way of looking at the world, and not just, again, keep talking among ourselves, but to the future journalists or future allies who can help us think about this this fight going forward. And the last thing I just wanted to say right now is we got funding for a fellowship for the next several years for a journalist from Turkey, and I was interviewing a number of journalists from Turkey, and I was asking them all about this, really complicated moment for them in their country. One of the journalists said something that really had an impact on me, and I'm thinking about this all the time, and it's something I had never heard before. And she said, I said, how are you coping? How do you continue your work? And she said, well, she said, I try to think a lot about Buckminster Fuller and being the trim tab. And I'd never heard that expression. I'd not read a lot of Buckminster Fuller, but I did after this call with her. And it's this, are any of you sailors or boaters or fly plane? It's, the trim tab is a very small mechanism that on a boat, say, with very slight movement, you can have dramatic impact on the trajectory of the ship, say. And Fuller would talk about this, and he used to say, call me trim tab. And it was this deep belief in the power of subtle movements to start to bring about dramatic change. I started to think about that and was thinking about it a lot in recent weeks when we were in the United States marking the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, and how that movement started with trim tab gestures. And the power of that to, over time, if we're all making those movements, to bring about a larger impact in this arena we care so much about.
Thank you. A quick question for Anne-Marie before a question for everyone on the panel. This powerful idea of that war no longer exists, and the coverage of that war is no longer possible. Can we extend that to politics and the coverage of politics? It's not just the combatants who don't need us anymore. I mean, Trump can just tweet and millions of people can hear directly what he's saying.
That's absolutely true, and it doesn't start with President Trump. You know, the Obama starting with the 2008 campaign was quite famously successful in creating its own story outside journalists as storytellers. And they were successful with that, not just in the campaigning, the 2 campaigns for the presidency, but throughout the 8 years in office. There was a lot of criticism about that from the media, but in the end, you know, media are powerless to change that. What we have is control over our own content. But no, we're not the sole source anymore.
Thank you. Rachel, yes?
So I feel there's an optimistic trend that sometimes we forget about, which is that, yeah, Trump can tweet all he wants and so can everybody else. But actually, after the US election, we saw a rise in people paying for subscriptions for lots of serious news media. So the New York Times subscriptions went up. In the UK, subscriptions for Private Eye, which is both a satirical magazine and a news and politics investigative magazine, went up to what they said was the highest rate of subscriptions ever. Political magazines like Prospect have seen an increase in spike in their subscriptions. So I think that shows that there are people who are looking for news that is not 140 characters, or now a little bit longer, but has detail and is researched properly, and they're looking for more information. So I think that is one element that we need to remember and build on. And just building on Anne-Marie's point, there's 2 trends that we are particularly worried about at the moment, and one is that journalists get called terrorists and get labeled as terrorists, and we're seeing increasing numbers of reports on that, and also the way that fake news is being used to create a new set of law around the world. So where leaders create these fake news laws, which are then used to close down journalism and close down news media. Conveniently, fake news then just means news that I don't like when I'm leading a country. So I think we have to be really careful when we're talking about this. And there's political systems right now where they're talking about what legislation we need to, and the UK is one of these countries where they're looking at legislation on fake news. And I think we have to be very careful here, because there are all sorts of lessons that we could look at in terms of, if we do this here, it's the same model that is happening in Gambia, where the government is using these fake news laws to close down news organizations they don't like.
Thank you. I have a question for all 3 of you, but allow me to acknowledge the presence of my colleague, my friend, and the executive editor of Rappler, the President Duterte's favorite news site in the Philippines, Maria Ressa. Irene spoke about about networks being incredibly important. Anne-Marie asked the question, who are our allies? Rachel talks about creating a powerful coalition of, what was that again? Allies outside journalism. Can we kick around that idea a bit? What does it mean? Do we work with politicians? Do we work with interest groups who are, of course, invested also in press freedom, security of journalists, and so on? What does that mean?
I think it means, so the phrase work with politicians is kind of a little troubling, and I think that's, however, journalists have always taken advantage of political systems. There are First Amendment lawyers who, take advantage of, who try to make law or to change law or to break law, to reverse law. in order to create the best standards for in which journalists can, best environment in which journalists can do their work. And I think we need to really continue that. One thing that is a little troubling is while there is in fact the Trump bump that you're referencing in terms of subscriptions for some of the paid subscriptions for some of the larger news institutions. We have hundreds and hundreds that have, for instance, aren't employing First Amendment attorneys anymore because they can't afford that. And so when there are legal challenges to the work that they do, they go unanswered. So that, I think that's a really distressing situation. But again, all these groups I mentioned and others that my colleagues mentioned, I think we can form around specific issues really powerful coalitions. We have the editor of Rappler here. Her managing editor is at the Nieman Foundation this year as a fellow, and the response from our fellowship community to the attacks that you're undergoing in the Philippines right now was really encouraging. And so I think just even getting outside of our own countries and our own immediate sphere of concern is really, really important. And I definitely find in my, I work in an academic community now, the number of people, so President Faust a year ago said, I want to respond to this moment in some way. Let's have a conversation about this. Post-truth was the year of the word of the year, and let's respond to this moment. It was a cold, snowy, wintry day in Cambridge. We called this forum for Sanders Theater, which is the largest kind of venue on campus. And like today, I said, who's going to show up? Thousands of people. I mean, we have video of people standing in line because people wanted to be part of some solution and some conversation and some discussion of these issues post-election. Because without that, what are we to do? And so I think taking advantage of that enthusiasm / concern about the current political moment, we have many routes to take in having that conversation.
I think when you're being attacked online, I think one of the most powerful responses is to get a whole group of people from different places around your country, different voices, unexpected voices, as we were talking about before, from different backgrounds, so science, history, doctor, actors, all sorts of people, to be on your side, because the sound of numerous voices hitting back is much stronger, and sometimes comes as a surprise to whoever is targeting you. So I think in lots of ways alliances can be very powerful. We've just published a magazine looking at the attack on history, or the way that history is now being manipulated, and I said to Tom Holland, who's a historian in the UK, historians and journalists are often on the front line when attacks on truth start to happen. And if you look around at countries at the moment where this is happening from, it's actually happening all over the world, governments are using a manipulated, shined up version of their own history to back up their politics. So I think historians are an obvious ally, but so there's lots of other groups and perhaps less obvious ones that we can look to and get to support us.
Thank you. Irene, I get the impression that in Argentina, when you spoke about the networks in Argentina, you were talking about journalists banding together. But do you see them reaching out to academics and other?
Yeah, I think there's so much division in the society and a lot of division along political lines, as Rachel was saying before. So, you're either on the left or on the right with the government or against the government. And so a lot of journalist communities especially are just kind of breaking up. And when it comes to Argentina and this financial pressure, everyone is just out there looking for a job and they are not cooperating much. Although this would be a great time to be out there and actually fighting for everybody's rights. And I think a lot of times from my experience in Latin America especially, governments take notice of certain issues when the international press reports on it. And this is picking up on what you were saying as well, Anne-Marie. I think as a journalist, I've reported a lot as an international sort of correspondent, and the times I picked, freedom of expression issues or written for index, etc., then the government takes notice. They're like, oops, we're gonna get in trouble. And they don't necessarily do much about it, immediately, but there is definitely a way where by forming, I think, more international networks, countries that sometimes are a little bit off the political agenda or off kind of the big networks can really benefit from that.
Thank you. I'm happy to say that we exactly have 25 minutes left. I promised that we would have time for questions. And as Rachel would like to emphasize, proposed solutions also from the audience. Anyone? Yes, please. Last row.
Hi. Is this on? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Claire Provo. I'm the editor of 50/50, the gender and sexuality section of Open Democracy. And I wanted to ask, probably this is for Irene specifically, to talk a little bit about the specific threats and attacks on women journalists in particular, perhaps in the Latin American context, and the gender dimension of what you talked about. And also, if you could just mention again the name of that app that you referenced briefly that does the risk assessments for journalists.
The app is called Salama, S-A-L-A-M-A, and it's actually been used in several parts of the world, but I've actually only spoken to Mexican journalists who've used it. But do we? Shall I just go ahead? Or?
Yes, please.
Okay. So of course, gender is a big deal. I think, of course, in Mexico there have been a lot of cases of murdered female journalists, and oftentimes you'll see that the response to criticism when it comes from a female journalist then becomes very, very vicious in a very sort of gender-based way as well. So, for example, Correa, who was so famous and creative with his insults, he called one reporter who'd published an investigation on him, Sandra Ochoa, he called her a little fatty, and completely dismissing her as this woman who should be at home, kind of taking care of her own business. I think what you're bringing up would be very interesting to kind of like come up with like specific examples of where gender becomes an extra issue. I know personally that when I've worked in certain areas, I've decided to work with local male journalists to kind of counterbalance the fact that I was a woman. And for example, in Mexico on the border with the US, I've often worked with male fixers to kind of, because I felt that otherwise I would have been perceived as weaker, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it would be very interesting because also there are not, that I know of, big kind of networks of female journalists kind of like helping across the line or across countries. So I'm not sure I can actually answer your question, but I think it's very interesting and it would be very interesting to look into.
I wonder if Rachel has, like, based on the work of Index on Censorship or the mapping the press freedom areas in Europe, whether you have something to, some insights on the gender issue. I mean,
we know that, for instance, women receive a lot more rape threats. I was talking to someone last night about women journalists that she knows getting hundreds of rape threats in each week. I don't want to spotlight anyone, but there are people in this room who work in countries where, I know a lot of women journalists who go into Yemen, for instance, and Iraq. And some of them are in this room and may want to speak about that more specifically. I went to a very good session yesterday with women women reporters in Egypt talking about specifically how they feel the various pressure, this sort of pressure of, or the threat of sexual assault is obviously much more prevalent to women journalists than it is to men in that country.
Other question, please? Yes, please. In front. Second row.
My name is Jean-Paul Martos. I'm a Belgian journalist. I'm a member of the editorial board of Index, so I'm part of conflict of interest. But just one issue. There are many fronts on which we can fight, and the front that I know best is the EU institutions and the way they can be used in a better way to help journalists protect themselves. And when I've been covering many, big questions around the capacity of the EU to help journalists, and when you talk to the officials in Brussels, and quite often they say we are being underutilized. For instance, the emergency funds, for instance, to protect journalists, most of the fund is not spent, and you are able to get emergency fund $10,000 for us. We use that for a Russian journalist who had been beaten up in Russia, to help him go through hospitals, and unfortunately he died after. But we were able to mobilize money to help him get access to the hospital setting. And I have the feeling that when you talk to power, and Brussels, it's a very uncertain and fragile institution. As time as EU, it still has a number. It still has a few strengths that you can use as a journalist. For instance, in the case of Ecuador, when there was the negotiations of the free trade agreement, there was not that much attention given to the human rights clause, for instance. And on the side of the Ecuadorian press freedom organizations, they came to Brussels, but they didn't have necessarily the right connections or the right understanding of very complex institutions. And on the other side, the people representing press freedom groups in Brussels didn't know that much about Ecuador. So there's a always this kind of asymmetry when you do advocacy with the European Union. And in the case, again, of Ecuador, Korea, for instance, you mentioned academic institutions, is someone who is very sensitive to his image in Europe. He studied in the university in which I'm teaching journalism, and I know he was very sensitive, and he tried to avoid any public discussion of what he was, because he was projecting an image of being someone progressive, as you mentioned, because he gave the asylum to Julian Assange, but he was very weak, and we were not able to mobilize enough resources to make sure that his contradiction would be apparent in Brussels at the moment when the free trade agreement was discussed. And we could have, battled much better on the question of human rights and human rights clause, because it opens up a number of opportunities for local groups, because there's a human rights dialogue in which local groups have to be present. And all those things are underutilized, and we are quite fragmented as a press freedom lobby, and we don't. Of course, there are coalitions, and mapping media freedom is a form of coalition. But internationally, there's a lot that can be done still to make sure that we can better work together, especially in front of those kinds of institutions like the EU, where there is some possibility to get resources, to get diplomatic influence, to get support, political support. And I think it's being underused. We should think more about using them better.
Thank you. That Brussels official that you spoke to, I think maybe we should sit down with him. Would anyone like to respond to that? There's an opportunity right there.
Well, I would just say I completely agree, and we were talking before the panel about how some of those relationships are broken at the moment, given some of sort of the condition of global politics, but they won't be broken forever, and new alliances will materialize. And we can't just sort of stop and give up on those kinds of conversations because they're more difficult at the moment. And you do still have things like, the Committee to Protect Journalists met with, went to Mexico to meet with President Peña Nieto and to talk specifically about these issues. He allowed them in, he met with them, he talked to them. A consequence was he replaced the prosecutor who oversaw a tranche of cases that included these attacks on journalists. That has not changed yet Mexico's place on the so-called impunity index, which CPJ publishes, and I know you look at that too. And but this notion that you keep pushing that conversation and applying international pressure, pressure outside of your own immediate communities, I think is a very important and powerful one.
Thank you. Yes, the gentleman at the back, and then the lady.
Hello, my name is Jassim Ahmed, and I'd like to ask about the challenge of the public, seeing the public as allies, the wider public, beyond any groups. So what do you think are some examples, some of the best examples you could think of showing the public what's at stake and building and maneuvering public support?
Thank you.
You can go ahead. I'm not sure.
I'm a daughter of a school teacher, so I'm a big believer in education. I'm the product of public schools. I'm a big believer in those as institutions. And I think something that is very frightening at the moment is this notion of fundamental, so I'll speak for the United States right now, or about the United States right now, this notion of very fundamental concepts and rights, the First Amendment, that in the last couple of years, it's been reframed as as sort of as an elite notion, as a privileged notion, when in fact it is by definition the opposite of that. I mean, the whole notion of the First Amendment is anti-elitism, and that's a very, very dangerous, I think, moment. And so that says something about failing public education to me, and how we're framing these very notions, rather than being, sort of baseline construction for everything we do, being a notion that that's just a privilege of elite journalists who are in the business of creating fake news. That's the next leap that occurs. So there's not an easy answer to that. Education is a very big word, but we know how to do that. It's not something, it's not curing cancer, which we don't know how to do. We know what effective education looks like. And I think journalists have to commit to playing some role in that conversation, even if it's as basic as, something in their own communities, against this notion of the trim tab, right? That we can start to affect these changes. So we do a big conference at Nieman every year for college journalists. And we just finished one this past weekend. And college journalists don't all want to grow up to be journalists. It's sometimes something they do in college. But we bring them in, and we expose them to to attorneys who work on their behalf in college campuses all over the country on First Amendment rights. We talk to them about what it means to be a free press. And it's really interesting to see these students walk in, told one thing by their administration about what their rights are as college journalists, and to leave the campus with a very different notion of what that means, and not just what their right is, but what their responsibilities are on behalf of that. So, that's tedious work in a lot of ways, but we know what it looks like. So that's just one piece of it, Jassim, I think.
I think another way of extending the question about gaining an engaged public is quite literally engaging the public in different ways, explaining the news cycle to them, getting rid of the mindset that news is defined only by the professional gatekeepers. There are other ways of defining news, that sort of thing. Embracing the technology that the public, especially the younger sectors, are using. I think there are many of these things, but the emphasis on education, I think, is key. Anyone else?
I would just say that journalists need to learn how to speak to people outside journalism. I think some of the most productive ways of getting over the power and the importance of journalism come from things like Hollywood films, like The Post, and also talking about real examples that make a difference to people's lives. So where there's a play in the West End in London right now which is about a group of women who challenged the fact that they were getting paid less than men working in a factory in the 1960s. And the role of journalism, the role of freedom of expression in helping magnify issues where people feel that a wrong is done to them and that they can gain something out of it that makes a huge difference to their lives. I think if we can explain journalism in those kind of terms and say, I've been talking to people about why they should value the right to protest recently, and because I think it's under threat in lots of places, and the way I've been trying to talk to people is thinking about, for instance, the suffragette movement, because it's very topical, what it would be like for your grandmother or your great-grandmother who, if she hadn't had the right to protest, what about, how would they have achieved the right to vote in that country without these tools? So I think using really colorful examples where change was made can be very useful.
And I often get asked by people why the BBC did. I do a lot of work for the BBC, and why the BBC did certain thing, or why the New York Times did a certain thing. And oftentimes people outside of journalism don't necessarily understand the difference between editorials and not editorials. And so we were actually talking about it with a few colleagues these days, and I wonder what, to what extent do you just trust the public, and to what extent can you actually differentiate, for example, these things, to avoid creating confusion, and for example, to really engage the public, to make so that people know when they're just listening to commentary that may not be completely fully informed or based on verified and checked facts versus proper journalism, investigations where the facts have been verified, etc. And oftentimes I struggle with that because I want to believe that people will understand the difference, but I feel that some publications don't necessarily market that well, and I feel that, for example, there's things that we can do better also as journalists, editors, to make sure that we're all on the same page as to this is what we as journalists do. This person is not a journalist, but a commentator, for example.
Thank you. Yes, the lady in the back.
Thank you. My name is Ruchi. I'm from India. And one of the countries that is facing very, very strong repression across the board, across institutions, from academia, journalists, is India. And all the way from financial intimidation to vicious trolling to murders now of journalists. And it's been interesting what you spoke about also, the whole, with the social media, the whole aspect of one-way communication. And Modi, the Prime Minister, has, the last 4 years, has not had a single press conference. It's been brazen, completely brazen, and with complete impunity, the repression in India. So my question was, and yes, like you said, you can make allies across institutions because at the moment, literally every institution is facing very strong attacks and a takeover. But when society gets this polarized, and that polarization is also seen across the board, including within families. And how do we, because I like the idea of alliances and coalitions across borders with countries facing similar repressions, and India being a fairly big country, but somehow relatively, I don't see enough coming out even within Europe, and the guy has made many trips. how do we, I don't know, how do we concretize these alliances? What kind of, I mean, I just thought if we could speak a little more on that, or maybe there are responses on the murders which are now happening more regularly in India of any dissenters, be it intellectuals or journalists or writers. If we could speak a little more about that. Thank you.
Could we ask you to say something about that? What do you think that looks like in India? What should that look like?
What we have seen is that when there is this strong an impunity at the moment in India, and when there is such a deep polarization, because there's not just about the left or right, but there is such a deep takeover that even, like, we had a few months ago, Supreme Court judges coming out and doing a press conference saying we are scared that even judiciary is being taken over and, you know, cases are being placed in a certain way. But when now there are channels, or TV channels, and an entire industry to peddle not just fake news, but peddle its own propaganda with such force that even for the general public, it's now difficult to understand, because day and night, it's really like Rwanda radio or every night. And so there are equal number of channels also doing that. I see now some sort of alliances and protests of people coming up across institutions, recently with some gruesome rapes that have happened, which involved the government ministers themselves. But what I've seen is whenever there is a larger international attention, there is perhaps a little less, or there is some scare. And I don't know, I mean, my question was, how do we gather more solidarity or support, or is there a mechanism in place or a platform in place for responses, especially specifically because we're talking about journalism and an attack on journalism?
Sure. So, I mean, one way of thinking about it would be who is Modi influenced by? Who is he going to listen to? And are there any of those people or those organizations that you could reach so that the message that you want comes from them? Now, I don't know what they are. You're much better informed on those than I am. But, I mean, I think it's different in each individual country and region. But I was talking to the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia, and they are looking to get the EU to influence the Maltese government because the Maltese government listens to the EU. Now, if you were talking to a Russian, they would say, well, the EU has no influence over Putin, so there's no point trying to mobilize the EU. So I think the pressure points are different for each country, and sometimes you can work out, could I create an alliance with this group and this group who have those, connect to those interests and actually also want to see a free press because it's in their interest to do so. It's similar to Argentina, though, right? Where there were no press conferences for a long time.
Yes, and Ecuador and everywhere else. Yeah.
I'm going to ask our speakers. We only have 3 minutes left. So I'd like to ask them to speak, to give a closing statement in 25 seconds each. And then I'll try to wrap up everything. Can we start with, let's start with Rachel.
Okay, difficult. I think that it's really a responsibility on all of us as journalists to try and think about solutions and share those solutions, because I think there can be practical things, and it's very easy to talk about the problems, which we do a lot. But it's much more difficult to think about the solutions. So I think we should spend more time on that and try and work out, how we can modify them for different areas and different regions, but try and come together as a group of professionals and create something that is shareable.
Thank you. Irene?
I think it's very important. I mean, I'm often negative when I'm asked, like, do you think that actually solutions, as you asked before, can they fix anything? But I think it's important not to not to despair and to try and set up those networks, like from a kind of one-on-one basis. Like you meet one person, you get on, you try and like negotiate that, and then it's one more and one more. And there's really so much that single people can do, but I think the little by little things can change a little bit.
Thank you. And Marie?
It is really hard to I guess I would go back to this notion that as a collective, there is a fair amount of power, and as individuals, we seemingly have very little. But I mean, just as a thought exercise, if everybody in this room before they left here or as they were walking out thought of one thing they can do, and there are things. I mean, go read about Marcela Turati, an amazing journalist in Mexico, who started, Journalists for Peace, and has done just extraordinary work as a journalist, but on behalf of journalism in that country. And, follow her on her social media, read what she posts. If you have an opportunity to donate to somebody like that ever, whatever, in whatever small way you can, go to the CPJ site. They've got currently this campaign to get small groups together and write letters to these imprisoned journalists around the world. And they've got forms online that you can do that, by yourself or with a group of colleagues, which they will bundle and get to these people who are, who are in cold and distant places in the world, suffering for their journalism. I mean, I know that all seems really small, but it's out of all those collective actions that the bigger solutions will arise.
Thank you. We're a minute over time. Just give me 30 seconds to wrap everything up. I offer you 4 C's. This is what I learned from today. From Anne-Marie, we need to contextualize the moment. We need to understand the historical conditions. From Irene, we need to consolidate our ranks. From Rachel, we need to coalesce with groups outside journalism, maybe starting on specific issues. And last, from the audience, we need to connect with the public. We need to think of the public not just as an audience, but as a community. And on that note, I would like to thank Irene, Anne-Marie, and Rachel. Thank you very much. And you for spending time with us. Thank you.